would like to pick up a bit on this issue I started in the first lecture, which kind of tried to focus on the role of voice in discourse. So the role of voice in discourse and its relation to code and the articulation of the void. So the void as if you want, a referent to ciphers, because that's what a cipher is. A cipher constitutes an alphabet, and an alphabet means everything that you can say in it, you can also negate it. But it's a closed body or instrument of articulation. So this is a bit the context. And I would like to, so my interest with this combination, so voice, discourse, and void, is to explore what it would mean to think of publicness in terms of place, not in terms of space. That's a very, a public space, that's a very prominent way to approach the question of the public, but also not in the sense of the public as a sphere, which is more, I don't know if it's a more international approach, but it's a very strong approach that now I can't name his name, this discourse, the German philosopher, the analytical philosopher who is talking about communication and discourse from the Frankfurt School, but he's still alive. He has this Hasenscharte. It's very prominent, you know. Habermas, yes, Habermas made a very strong case in approaching the public through the figure of the sphere, die Sphäre des Öffentlichen. And part of this intellectual kind of war, for those of you who are familiar with it, between Habermas and Sloterdijk, concerns the same issue, because Sloterdijk as well makes in his 3 books, the bubbles, the globes, and the third one, spheres, a very strong case for rethinking communication in terms of spheres with respect to the public. But I'm interested in, through a thinking of a physics of the meteora. So the meteora is this, the domain of the weather, the meteorology, where everything is cyclical and circular, but you can't bring it to a hierarchy of a space. No? So the scales in the weather, they're not dimensions. They're percolating. They're participating in each other. They're letting things passing through. So it's a different understanding of the sphere when we look at it through the meteora tradition. And my interest is to basically reconsider how we could reconnect with the notion of place, which doesn't situate it in this dominant trend of vernacular architectures, where place becomes linked very much to local traditions and customs. So to an entirely cultural, to an entirely social sphere. But to have a notion of place which reconnects, so it does this, the vernaculars are crucial, but it reconnects with metaphysics, or what I would call metaphysical gestures. So this is the overall picture. To make this more graspable, there is I find a beautiful short passage. It's from Werner Hamacher, again, this philologist I was talking about, with whom basically I think it's possible, I mean, with whom he's very helpful to think these things together. So that's enough, that's a lot. So he has this passage here where he speaks about place. He says, for Aristotle, place is marked by 2 traits, by the fact that it is separate from the thing, and by the fact that it is surrounding, that is, by the fact that it participates in a boundary with the thing, and by the fact that it parts this boundary. Place is thus the imparting, the Mitteilung. Mitteilung is what is at the core of communication in the German language, of the boundary of things, and in this sense, the medium of things themselves. It is the width of the boundary. Then he quotes Aristotle. The place is with the thing. The boundary is with the bounded. So this is where it links to Anaximander and the notion of apeiron that I will come back to. It is not only the structure of time that, as Derrida has shown, depends on this width. It is also the structure of place that depends on it. But this width is not a localized one. It is the placing of place and the granting of space. For it is only by virtue of this width, the medium both of discretion and of cohesion, that a place is given. The boundary lies with the boundary, and thus with that which marks the difference between and the unity of both boundaries opens up the place. With is thus not a determination of place, a possible answer to the question of where something is. It is the granting of place, and it does not posit it at or together with a place, but opens up the place as a with and as at. So this relates to a kind of a prepositional logics. No? So to say the prepositions embody the indexes that demarcate a presence. The together with of things is a together with of their being together with their being without each other. So yeah, that's a conundrum. But it's the presence of the nothing in the principle of identity that he's referring to. And this presence of the nothing is the reference in terms of which ciphers, and that means codes, can articulate. Place is the with of the with the without, the with without with of all bodies. And this is what relates them to each other and what keeps them apart, their relation. Place carries them and brings them apart and together, a double carrier of the double boundary, an amphora. And this notion now I find it very helpful, the amphora, because an amphora, no, so well, if you want the most invariant meaning of the metaphor is to be a vessel. A metaphor transports things. But what changes when we call the vessel or the metaphor an amphora is that it is a volume constituted by two boundaries. One on the inside, which actively contains nothing. So it's an empty vessel. No? A vessel is a vessel because it can carry something. So it is empty. This is where Heidegger's sentence was so striking. No? He was fighting with this interpretation that says we can't take the nothing into account, and he says no. Let's keep den Krug. Let us allow for the vessel to keep the nothing which it contains. It's a very pathetic sentence in Heidegger, but an important one. So then there is one boundary which contains nothing, and another boundary which bounds against the indefinite or the infinite. If we think of an amphora in these architectonic terms, I would call them architectonic terms. So then this is another passage from Hamacher, which attends to it from another angle. He says, place is not only something discrete, it is discretion itself. So discretion, which is this act of cutting, but it doesn't produce a cut or a boundary. So the being of discretion steps in for the problem in philosophy, whether there can be nothing. No? So the problem of the void and the vacuum. So it becomes discretion itself as a kind of, I would call this a weather. No? So discretion is an activity and it has a being, but it manifests only locally with respect to such a notion of place. And this I find it very strong. So then he elaborates to give it a context. All his colleagues, the philosophers and so on, they all speak of the opening of place, of the discretion of its giving, and the indiscretion of its gift. Shakespeare's caskets, the crates, suitcases, tins in Goethe, the jars in Kleist of Simmel, Bloch and Adorno, Keats' urn, Kierkegaard's drawers and secretaries, Mallarmé's cinéraire amphore, E.T.A. Hoffmann's The Golden Pot and Henry James' The Golden Bowl, casket and castration in Freud, geodes and jars in Rilke and Celan, La Valise and La Cruche in Ponche, Kafka's suitcases, Beckett's ash bins, La Vase in Lacan, etc., etc. So this casts a very interesting focus, I think, on what we usually call the möbel, no? So that which is mobile, so the furniture, basically. But the furniture, which comes to play a constitutive role for the space in which it is being placed, in which it is mobile, because it has this cryptographic relation to the outside of the space, so to the open of the weather. Good. So they are like two motivic keys now. It's helpful, I think, if you keep those pictures in mind with regard to what comes. Another angle to look at this relation between place and space and public and private, inside and outside, is the relation between body and space. Between body and space. And this here is a text by Indra Kaggis McGeevan with the title Whose Body? And what she elaborates on is this very strong idea, which is there in Vitruve, that Vitruve wants to give indications of how to write the body of architecture. So the writing in Vitruve is the writing of the body of architecture. And the question that she raises is, whose body should that be? So we could say the public body, but that doesn't help much as yet. And what she discusses is, it needs to be nobody's body in particular. And what she criticizes in Vitruve, so hers is a kind of an angry book about Vitruve, because her argument is that Vitruve is actually writing the body of the emperor Augustus, which is a symbolical body which manifests as an empire, not in terms of what we would call a public place, but as a logical place. And she discusses this with regard to this one scene which is in Vitruve. I haven't really researched that, but probably you are familiar with it. The Dinokratus, I think he's called. There is a passage where an architect talks about a kind of a competition, and then there was the submission of a project by one architect which wanted to shape the Athos, the mountain Athos, which is quite a spiritual place for the Greeks, according to the shape of a kind of a big figure, no? So a king. And then Vitruve discusses that that architecture, if it would represent a body like that, would not be architecture at all. It would be sculpture. And architecture cannot be sculpture, otherwise it's not architecture. Yeah, so that's how he translates or transforms the question of writing the body of architecture. That should be the body of no one in particular, because it cannot be a sculpture that produces a double of a real referent. So that's the setup. And this, I find it very interesting with regard to the discussions we had with the project yesterday, no? With the horseshoe. Why is it so offending? It has something to do with this topic again, no? Good, but then what do they mean with body at that time? Because at the time of Vitruve, there was not a notion of space as we think of it. So that is the main point which I think is so important about bringing back a metaphysical kind of intellection or thinking. And metaphysical then strictly means not ontology and categories and logical systems, what the Enlightenment was so angry about, but it's the pre-Socratics. So it's the natural philosophers, which were thinking of the elements, so fire, water, earth, and air, in terms of a kind of a bodily metamorphosis or transformation. So the different pre-Socratic philosophers, they differ by making, by proposing dogmas, so doctrines, and that doesn't mean that they claim it is true. They say this is a working model and it can explain a lot, no? And then they were not at war with each other, they were working with each other, but developing, like from different angles, what would be the implications if we say the primary body out of which everything kind of evolves is water? And what changes if we say it is fire? And what changes if we say it's all of them continuously mixing? So these are the distinctions between Heraclit and Thales and Anaximenes and all of these. And in this setup, Anaximander and Pythagoras stand out because they were inventing abstractions of how to think of the transformability of fire, water, earth, and air into each other. And these abstractions, they are not, they don't try to grasp something empirical. So the apeiron, as this notion of the unbounded or the boundless, is not something that could be observed. No? So it's an abstraction which is posited as a principle, which is abstract. So it's nobody in particular. And of course, the claim would be that these principles are universal. So the apeiron is of that kind, and in Pythagoras, it's a different abstraction, which is further articulated. And this is the tetractys in Pythagoras. It's the tetractys as a kind of a key to unlock the harmony of the spheres. So the tetractys is derived from his harmonics, from his musical theory, which in a way says that the musical harmonics is a kind of a miniature of a cosmos, of which he also thought spherical. Because if you have an idea that fire, water, earth, and air transform into each other, that's what that's where the spheres, the idea of spheres that are nested but percolating and transforming, is coming from. So these two, they stand out as what I would say an introduction of a level of the transcendental, no? But it's an objective transcendental. It's not the transcendental like Kant introduced it, where he said everything that we can reason originates in the mind of a subject. It's objective. It's an objective kind of transcendental. And for this, Pythagoras and the apeiron, so the tetractys and the unbounded, are very interesting, I would say, metaphysical, so artifacts of metaphysical gesturing, let's say. And then this gesturing is a bodily notion, but of no one in particular, because it concerns these elements. It concerns nature, not politics, not power, not the social sphere. It's objective. And then when we look at, so I want to look specifically at Anaximander, because it is so helpful with regard to the meteora and to the transformation of the elements. So this is just a table of contents of a book by I'm not sure if an American or a British scholar. He's called Guthrie. Probably this is pronounced totally different. But Guthrie is one of the philologists or classicists who worked extensively on kind of providing access again to these topics that is not filtered through German idealism. That's the beauty of it. I find that very important. Because through German idealism, everything crystallizes in the world spirit, in history, no? with a big H. So with regard to Anaximander, he organized his discussion according to this. So he says the unlimited or the unbounded is the arche. And arche is this name for a principle, for a body which is primary. And it should be a body which is a body of nothing in particular and no one in particular. And then he says, so this, the unlimited, what it does is it bridges or it provides a kind of an amphora for opposites. And through doing that, there is a link that allows to start to think from the registers of cosmogony to cosmology. And the importance here is that a cosmogony, so this is Hesiod, no? This is the stories that first there was the embrace of Gaia and Uranus, and then, yeah, there are funny stories, no? So Gaia convinced one of her unborn children, because she kept, so the embrace, there was never a separation of the embrace, so she kept producing more and more and more children, but she could never give birth to them. So she convinces one of her unborn children to secretly cut the penis of Uranus, and then he withdrew, and then there is the birth of the world, no, out of that. So then the Earth is there, and the unborn child who did this cutting, this is the birth of Kronos. So with that we have countable time, which belongs to the Earth. So, but it's these kinds of stories. There are many of them, and all these abstract powers that kind of make sense when thinking about, or that were mythologically grounded. They became persons, no? And there was a genealogy. So there was an initial embrace, where nature was organically a meaning to conceive and to give birth. So that's a kind of a mythical way to refer to the gods, and it knows that it's a mythical way. Yeah. So, but it's a kind of a discourse, you could say, on the gods, which is mythical, and mythical means these gods. So the stories, they cannot really be historicized. You can't really tell a chronological story of them, because every time that people attempted to do it, they will just give new character traits to the persons which already existed. But if they get new character traits, the stories are no longer totally convincing. So you could also imagine the story to have unfolded differently. And this kind of dynamics is why, for example, but not only, but Michel Serre calls myth algebra. No? So algebra and myth, they correspond. So you have a domain of metamorphosis where everything can in principle become everything else, but through a play of permutations and structural transformations and so on. But it's the mythical domain is a domain of continuity. So it's algebra. It's algebra without producing articulations, which become objects that means are taken out of the continuous transformation and placed somewhere. And then, so it opens, the Apeiron opened up the possibility to start to think of a logos that would relate to this myth of the cosmogony. And this logos then becomes architectonic, because the logos takes the words with respect to an order that is not given by the myth, but that is abstract from it. So this is where you start to have an architectonics or an architecture of the cosmos, for which, for example, or not for example, the main reference for this is the Timaeus by Plato. So it's an architect. The demiurge is a public worker, and he the Timaeus tells a kind of a mythical story, but it's not really a myth anymore, which gives an account of how the universe was constructed. No, not its genealogy where it derives from, but how it was constructed. And the Timaeus is the story. It starts by saying the demiurge took the soul of the universe, put it in a pot, mixed it all up, poured it out, and threw it into a long line, an infinite line. And then he cut into this long line, which is the soul of the universe, and he made two interlocking spheres. And one of these spheres is the domain of the intelligible, the other one is that of the sensible. And then the whole story unfolds in how the intelligible and the sensible, so these two spheres, index one another, no? And can never be put to rest, because it's an architectonic abstraction. So this kind of always remaining capable of accommodating something that has not yet been thought about it, that we know from myth. It is there in the architecture or in the architectonic of the Timaeus as well. So this is what we would call cosmology versus cosmogony. So genealogy versus architectonics. The distinction that Foucault picks up when he begins to speak of the possibility of there being order to discourse, no? Through the presence of a voice in discourse. But then, and that's my main emphasis with Anaximander and the Apeiron, it is not like in philosophy where logos becomes basically the absolute priority. No? So logos itself becomes a kind of a domain of the principle as soon as we start to think in terms of ontology. So metaphysics in terms of ontology. Different from that, in Anaximander, he brings it to the domain of meteora, of meteorology. And he discusses what the Apeiron can explain with regard to this. And it has to do with there being discretion. So in the way that Anaximander would think of the transformation between the elements, one into the other, there is always a casting off of something, which then is no longer part of the continuity. So he says, there's a separation. So it's a kind of a mixture between a genealogy and an architectonics. In his view, after water had been separated from earth, the sun drew vapor up from the water to form the atmosphere. This in its turn, as the separating out. So this is the key term with what the apeiron allows to think, a separating out. So it's a cutting, but then an acquiring of an autonomy or an objective presence or something which is being, put to the side of this transformative event. The separating out continues, divides into two substances, a lighter, finer and drier, and a heavier, a wetter. The former is set in motion as wind, the latter is precipitated as rain. It is all part of the same operation of peripheral heat on the moist center, which in due course was responsible for the emergence of life. So he is no longer speaking about the genealogy of personas, he's speaking about the nature of life, the emergence of the nature of life with this assumption. And this gesture of the separating out, it is the gesture which I think has a lot to do if we would want to think of publicness in terms of place and amphora and the being of discretion, or the weather of discretion, rather than the obsession with an act and consequences and sortment of the judgments and so on. But it's a kind of keeping in suspense, but where it comes very close to Hegel's thinking. But this keeping in suspense is not granted by the world spirit. So it's not granted by an idealism. It's granted by all the objects that exist. Yeah. So this natural philosophy, which challenges idealism, it does not get rid of the notion of the subject, but the notion of the subject is being embodied by perhaps we could say it's something like the crypticness of the objects. So Michel Serres puts this in a way, he says, when we need to think, when we are concerned with truth or knowledge, we need to always think through the meteora. That means respective to the world, not to an eternal beyond or something like that, but respective to the world. And with respect to the world, everything needs to think of itself, and we need to think of ourselves as objects among objects. But this among is crucial, because this among is not the unity of a mixed body, and it's not a neatly organized or a localized arrangement of things that kind of fit in together. So it's a objects among objects means we have these kind of scalarities like we know it from climate. So cycles, scales that do belong together, but also not. So there is between these scales don't transform into a homogeneous domain of dimension. And again, the best picture to get this, the drasticness of this is the powers of 10, no? Because you could say it goes between scales, but it remains within the dimensionality of the powers of 10. So, yes, this separating out, yeah, that was the main passage. So then how can we think of this meteora for philosophy, of this transcendental objective? This is, I want to read a short passage, 1 page or so, from, this is from my book on Michel Serres. This one chapter is entitled Meteora as the domain that becomes real or natural through the fact that we can count time. So what I find the beauty of saying we need to think even about subjectivity through the prism or through the optics of objects among objects is that we need no longer be at war with chronology. Yeah? Because of course chronology is insufficient to sustain an idea of history. It's always partial, it's always selected. but it is crucial for the presence of objects. So it's a domain of chronology, which is like the weather. So there is fertility from the weather. So the objects themselves become, they're not dead and purely abstract. They are an embodiment of a mixture of abstractness and concreteness, we could say. So Serre calls this the information physics, because information combines a logicial, so a kind of a logical notation, a logicial with materials, because it's le logiciel intramatériel. And this logiciel is not properly a logos. I would say it's a code. It's an alphabet or a coding. So that means it's not one. And what it does is it objectifies how things that exist, store, send, trade, and receive information. So this notion of information is how quantum physics describes everything, whether it's the DNA constitution of bodies in biotechnology, or aromas in food engineering, or electronics in the engineering of devices. It's always this kind of economy that has as its positive point information. So the conception of counting time that Serre advances with his discussion of the gnomon. The gnomon is that which gives us chronology. So the gnomon is, if you want, the gnomon allows, so it casts the shadows, but it can only do that by stopping time. So the gnomon only works if you say, we take as a reference point the moment at noon where the sun is in the right angle. And we inflate this one moment to stand in for time that in nature always passes, but we stop time in order to gain a theoretical point of view. So this is what the gnomon does. And Serre calls the gnomon an artificial intelligence. But it's an artificial intelligence which is at the same time natural. So it's not the other two natural intelligence. So what he advances with the gnomon insists that orientation comes from scales, not from an arche or a telos. Scales need be referred neither to a past nor to a future. They afford the keeping of records of the advent of things that make sense, from the term adventus, a coming, an approach, an arrival to. The records of scalar data tables, so this is what the gnomon does. No? So then you observe, so you get the analemma ultimately. So you get index points, but you need another system, and that's the logicial, which can make sense of it. So you observe. Okay, Elias will be speaking about these things. So the data achieved by counting time does not represent the empirical world without at the same time affecting it. Scales, so considered, draw direction from themselves and also give direction to themselves. So with it, we can think a self-referentiality which doesn't produce an empty logical tautology. And this self-referentiality is die Selbstbildung, let's say, that should happen in the public, in the way that I want to think of publicness. They propagate the wisdom with which the circular, through its partitions, the partitions manifest as scales, as spectra, sources a measure by unfolding it from itself, intercepted by scalarity, the indefinite cycle of reciprocity, characteristic of passing time, can accommodate itself in the locus in quo referenced by the chrono. Okay, I don't go there. So that's another way of saying an encyclopedia is the writing, the body of the public, but for Serre it goes from architectonics to the chronopedia. The important thing is that these objects, among objects, there's something like boxed complexions. And this boxed complexions is a different way of speaking of an anaphora, which has these two boundary sides. So it's a voluminous body, a voluminous geometric body, which has the two bounding sides. So boxed complexion, it incorporates a certain objective, but it doesn't exclude to be chance bound at the same time. And it facilitates a form of mastership, of impersonal mastership. Of such mastership, we can say that it does not submit the empirical world to its domination in any linear or simple way. Such mastership is mastership that knows how to welcome the real world at its tables. And the tables are these index points that the gnomon and the Gnomonics produces. But then you need to have a step of recipes of how to link up the index points. So there's an algorithmics. The wisdom of the gnomon that Sarah is describing is constituted from two things. One is algorithms, and the other is mnemotechnics. Mnemotechnic is a kind of an architectonics of how to keep memories and how to place memories and how to augment the capacity to store, basically, but in a vivid way. So, and then the point is, this kind of knowledge in antiquity is what is at the core of the treatises on meteorology. And this is very interesting because prior to, so Aristotle wrote a book on, actually he couldn't, no. So he kind of did, like Euclid, did a summing up of all the things that were already known and in circulation with respect to geometry. So Euclid didn't invent all this. He organized it, no? into a system. And in a similar way, Aristotle behaved with regards to all the knowledge that was there with respect to the meteora. And his problem was then that he has 3 books actually that try to organize this, and they can't be brought to a consistent system, which is part of why his book on meteorology has been largely ignored since the 18th century. We will come to that. But he has one book which is called De corruptione e generazione. So this is the mythic transformation of things that come into being and dissolve. Now everything becomes earth again, and then it gets born again, and so on. So this is the one book. The other book then is De Cielo. So it's of the heavens. So it tries to think in an analog way about astronomy and the bodies there. But there you have so what you get is a kind of a timelessness. No? So you have rotations in terms of a timelessness. So Aristotle made an assumption a bit like Anaximander with the apeiron, and he said, okay, there is an unmoved mover at the beginning. Yeah? There is an arche, there is a principle, but I'm not interested in it. I just position it, and then I keep these two things separate. But with these 2 books, so on the material transformations and on the heaven, on the skies, he could not explain natural phenomena like the emergence of vapor and of rainbows and the crystallization of water into snowflakes and all of these phase transitions. He could not capture. And in order to describe this without being able to accommodate it systematically in his notion of nature, he wrote a 3rd book, which is called the meteorology. And the meteorology in Aristotle, it gives like Euclid, except that it doesn't produce a system, a geometrical system, but it gives an account of everything that was held as a belief or as a doctrine or as a thesis at the time. And he has his own commentary on that. He elaborates, he positions, or he brings forth a certain thing. And for me, the most important about this relation with Aristotle is that he introduced, or he got to terms with something which is extremely subversive to his logical writings, and so he affirmed incommensurability in order to describe the natural transformations. And he said, what can we do with this problem? So such that it doesn't destroy the belief in system, in logical rigor, let's say. And he said it depends on the scales on which we compare things. And these scales have to do with a kind of I would call it a metaphysical, transversal thing that goes through the hierarchies of ontology. So the example that he chooses is when we speak of triangles, and we give so a triangle has 3 angles. And then we would illustrate or reference or represent that with a very particular triangle, with he names the isosceles triangle. There is an improportionateness between the general validity of the claim that the triangle has 3 angles and the iconic representation of this quality by one particular triangle. Both have a general validity, yeah, and both are purely formal terms, but they are, if we want to have one represents the other, there is a disproportion that results out of it. So the consequence of it is to say, even if we have a general, if we can have concepts that name things in a general form, we still have to always try to seek adequacy in terms of levels of abstraction. So this I find a very important notion with regard to thinking of a digital architectonics, where this proportioning, you know, we've had it now all the days. The proportioning becomes central, and geometry is central for it. Objectivity is central for it, but it constitutes a human nature. How we proportion constitutes a human nature. And in my understanding, the critiques on Enlightenment humanism or on Renaissance humanism are that the way that the human nature has been constituted then has become an empty representation, which does no longer fit our time. Yeah? But the problem is not humanism itself. The problem is that this lively system of inception of a proportionality that constitutes a humanism is not on the right level of abstraction as we need one today. So there writes, in antiquity, such knowledge, so that can deal with the incommensurable, belongs to the discipline that studied the meteora, a wisdom that reasons, judges even, with what I called equatorial scales. And the equatorial scales, so like the equator, huh? The equator goes around the globe, and it is substantiated empirically through the 2 points in every year that identify a certain amount of days as a unit on a higher scale. So a year, 360 whatever, or yeah, I don't know. So this certain amount of days, because this amount of days allows to identify when there is a solstice and an equinox. So when day and night are equally long. No? When it is equally long, and then when it collapses again. So these 2 moments in a year, they are the turning points that make time go round, no? And that give us a notion of worldly time. So a notion of time, the time of chronology, which does not need, in order to make objective statements and to open up a matrix, it does not need to be of one mind with regards to origin or ultimate meaning, end of time. So it's a secular time. So I call this equatorial scales. And the problem I had is that the equator is not really many. Yeah? It's one. So how then can I speak of scalarities and scales? And I had endless discussions with the editor and the copy editors. In the end, I managed to keep the term here, but it's not explained in the book. And the only way now that I found is something I didn't know at the point, and that's why I'm so euphoric now about Hamacher and Paul Celan, because they began to say the meridian plays a crucial role, not only the equator. No, the equator gives literally, if you think about the equator in terms of place, what we have is tropes. No? So we are in the space of metaphor, of poetics, but poetics in a mythic kind of sense. On the equator, everything can turn around into everything else if we are on the equator. So the equator gives us the Deleuzian time of a thick immanence, no? Where there is no breath, no presence for breath. With the meridian, and the meridian now is, if you want, the geopolitical aspect of it. The meridian gives us a global notion of tact with regards to time. So the meridian establishes the reference point of, what is it, this London time, that is the reference for calibrating all of the time systems worldwide. But it itself is totally arbitrary. No? It's a convention to take this meridian as that standard. But it introduces into the play of the troping equatorial transformations the role established by a standard with regard to actually inhabiting a real time that is global. So a real time that is that can establish as very directly globalization, because it facilitates the logistics, which makes our global world. It's the logistics. The logistics are index points. So this I didn't have here, but the equatorial scales, what I mean with them is, so then they produce scalarity. So the idea would be, if we have this global scales, we naturalize it. It means that the real time in which we live is not the only such time which could be global and real. Yeah. So then we can have, with these scalarities, we can have kind of like chronometry relative to topical durations, so to storytelling. So it's something like, yeah, natural. This is what I want to think of as natural history. Not history in an idealist sense, but as nature. And then there are many of them. And this is, I think, the domain where Serre was speaking of the chronopedia. So not the encyclopedia. The encyclopedia means basically one cycle, one circle in which everything that can be known finds its place. That's the idea of the encyclopedia. But it's one circle. And with the chronopedia, there are many of them. No? And then these many of them, they are like, in my understanding, they are like the vernacular languages. There are many of them, and there is translation necessarily between. And these vernacular languages now, I would refer them, because I'm interested in the objective, not so much at this point in the cultural, to the domains of knowledge. So then a vernacular that speaks of life as a physics in genetics is a chronopedia, which is different from the one which speaks of life in terms of chemistry or of molecular biology. It's literally on a different scale. No? So they are not only different scales, they are different scalarities that produce something like objective languages. And they're objective because they are organized, so their form, their syntax is mathematical, but their meaning and their semantics is grammatical. And the difference between an encyclopedia is that, and grammar, is that grammar tries, or that was, yeah, so grammar tried to be something like natural knowledge. Syntax is abstracted, it abstracts sets of rules out of it, but what it indexes is a space of grammar, and grammar would be the domain where logos, so where the words can be written, so where writing is primary to speech, basically. This is with grammar. And then there is another notion which I find important. It's this notion of the hereality, because we have with the anaphora, we have the voluminous way of thinking of a metaphor. So what is this? No, a metaphor, yes, it's in writing, maybe it's in speaking, we have the tropes, but what would be an architectonic of the metaphor? So then we need to go to the voluminous domain. And this voluminosity is not a purely formalist space, but it's also not really a body directly, no? Because the body would always be specific. And there is this notion of the hereality then. So every object, even if it's objects among objects, is also a subject because it is biased, inevitably biased. But the bias now is an objective bias. And it is what the term of hereality can stand for. Hereality means you have a mirror image, but you can't bring it to a covering. So it's like the two hands, they're left and right. They are, the algebra has the term of hereality that refers to it. So then the object, because an object, it needs to be comparable to other objects. Otherwise, it's not an object. No, it's a singular thing. As soon as we call it an object, it needs to be comparable. And so hereality intercepts the play of mirroring and representation and gives it a voluminosity, which of course gets scattered and gets a kind of an evolution of itself. So it's how the insistence on symmetry produces diversity. Yeah, because we have the anaphoras as vessels that can transport and translate and transcribe in between all of these scalarities. In my understanding, this is what Elias calls bridges. No? And that was what I was interested in here. So these equatorial scales, so the tropicality, it should not be the starting point, because then we can't think the meridian, and then we have the separation of the cultural, which produces the global economy and the capital evil and all of these things, versus a nature which we are consuming, no? And that makes nature a god, and that is not okay for science, for universities, privately of course, but not for publicness in such a sense, in a sense which wouldn't be religious. Primarily. Yeah. And there is, so then the meteora, it literally, so, or metaphorically, stood in antiquity for all that happens between the earth and the sky. So precisely the two books of Aristotle, De Cello and De Generatione, they are basically the bounds, or the Amphora bounds of the meteora. The meteora is everything that happens in between. But what happens in between comes out of so it comes from the body of the earth, not the fire with the lava. So it's not that the surfaces alone can facilitate this action. It comes from there, and there is also things which astronomy cannot answer that play a role. So the divine is not. It is only a secular approach on the level of the positivity that we can find in its description, not in what it means. So in terms of what it means, science doesn't claim anymore to be exhaustive about the things it allows to bring into play, no? To constitute as a public. So it's a notion of publicness which doesn't want to realize the ideal state. But it also doesn't say ideation or the thinking in terms of an ideal state is bad. No. It's just, it's not about realizing it. So then the ideas that are being articulated in public, of course, they're informed by faith, by beliefs, by wishes, by hopes, by all of these things. But to agree in terms of this transcendent domain is not the aspiration of sharing a public, no? of depending. Sharing a public basically means I agree to be depending upon you, and you agree to do the same, even if we don't know each other and even if we don't like each other. Yeah. So this is the relation to the institution of law I had been talking about. In law, there are always cases which need to be decided but cannot. And that's because law lives from the passing of time. Otherwise, it would be a logical system. And then it would be like a machine of doctrines, which is chosen here like this and there like that. Yeah, and so since we have the first day of Gnomonics, no? So the idea of the gnomon is that's what I loved in the approach of Serre. So he was asking then this wisdom of the weather. So here perhaps how Serre writes about it. He gives us again a scene, an old peasant scene. That means he makes a scene something general, but it's not a concept. No, it's like it's more like a morale or a fable or something like that. He says an old peasant scene, which is very typical for peasant life. Every morning upon waking, before deciding what work to start upon, the farmer examines and observes the sky and tries to assess, predict, evaluate, weigh the intemperate weather that awaits him, a problem that plunges his temperament, touch, sight, smell, memory into a formidably complicated mixture of wet and dry tempered together, of cold and hot, allied, making up the temperature of long and short, of continuous and broken, whose present promise permits avoiding the ravages of the tempest, or defines for plowing, sowing, grape harvest, or hay time, beginning or ending that favorable moment, the Greek language calls kairos, from the verb that again signifies mixing. So there is in this, so he then says, this is a kind of a knowledge. It's a wisdom or a knowledge of peasant life that allows each peasant to make these decisions in the morning. No? And these decisions, they're existential, they're not logical. So if he makes the wrong decisions, he loses his harvest. So it's existential. So the making of these decisions doesn't exclude rationality and reasoning and knowledge and objectivity, but it's not about being right in a logical or in a demonstrative or in a social sense. It's an existential situation. So it's like in court. No? So you have to make decisions, but it's not about legitimization. It's about existence of it. And he asks, who is the owner of such knowledge? Who was the privileged subject of such wisdom? You know, and the owner of such knowledge, this is the gnomon, because the gnomon allows to open up theoretical spaces to reason whatever kind of complex phenomena that you want to understand. But the implication of this is that geometry plays with rhetorics. It's on the level of rhetorics, not logics and not poetics, rhetorics. So because with geometry, you can objectify. If you let go of the principle of exhaustiveness of representation, you can objectify everything geometrically. So that's what the simulations do today. No, they don't do it geometrically, but they will always give you a legitimization reason for the thesis which they have put into a formula. So a simulation will never tell you your thesis is wrong. No? If you make a simulation that computes the limits of growth for humankind on Earth, there will always be an answer to it. The simulation will not tell you your question is ill-posed. Yeah. So, and so this kind of owner, and that's the ownership is important because it's what keeps the subject present in this world of objects among objects. Yeah. And the reference for it is the gnomon. It's the artificial intelligence. Good. Now, what to do with that? Oh, so you can go like, so what to do with that? And this is a passage. So I was interested in developing the idea of what I call the quantum literacy with regard to that. And the quantum literacy is like every literacy, just as much with rhetorics, with poetics, with logos, with grammar, with syntax. It's a power, it's impuissance, it's immoral. A quantum literacy, so a kind of a trivium, so a way to think in the registers of text and of language, but in a way that incorporates the artificial intelligence of the quadrivium that constitutes the modern sciences. So this is basically the setup that I was interested in. And one of the, to picture what this, to imagine what this would mean or entail is still, I find it very difficult. But one passage that helped me was from Gilbert Simondon. He is a very interesting figure. He kind of kept a catalog of technical objects, of technical artifacts, but he was interested in claiming that there is an existence to the technical objects. So that's something that usually would not have been attributed to an artifact and certainly not to a technology. No. So that they have an existence means they have a kind of an inner life. It's a kind of an animation of technical objects. And Simondon was then he opened up a kind of a phenomenotechnical study of the genealogies of technical artifacts. So he would start to think about where, I don't know, what kind of ideational domain does the toaster come from? No? And he wouldn't just say, well, in terms of physics, it's this. And in terms of fantasies, it's, I don't know, American housewives who get emancipated from baking bread. No, it doesn't do this split. He tries to think meteorologically almost about these things. And he has this one interview with a person called Anita Kehikian, where he says something that had, for me, it was because it was so scandalous when I read it. So I was so imprinted that anthropomorphizing is really bad. So to make technical objects animate, it's just an anthropocentrism. So we are just projecting ourselves into it. So Simondon was, to me, very upsetting. And the reason why I could dare to think about it, so I didn't just exclude it out of comfort zone reasons, was actually that Gilles Deleuze makes a big thing of Simondon. So, and he showed a different way to approach it. So this is where I got interested, but much later only I found this interview, which really helps to clarify. So it's, the question goes, in 1958, you wrote about alienation produced by non-knowledge of the technical object. Do you always have this in mind as you continue your research? The interesting thing here is that alienation in Marxist philosophy is a totally social category. So it's always the power games which force you to alienate. And alienation is a kind of an imposture of a socially objective necessity. And what Simondon tries to do is to think of the same effect of alienation, but not socially produced, but as an effect, as a symptom of illiteracy, no? Of ignorance, of not having proper, adequate, proportionate relations to the technical objects, which are the products of all these power relations that a Marxist critique on industrialization would foreground. So his point is precisely, we don't give the technical artifact an autonomy. They are not more than what the production chain has wanted it to be. So we deprive it of its symbolical autonomy or something like that. And Simondon wanted to go for a mode of existence that would apply to the technical objects in order to grant them a certain autonomy relative to this. And this certain autonomy, the way that for me this was acceptable was to say, yes, no, technology is totally natural. There's nothing that we can do in technology which wouldn't be, which we haven't learned from nature. Even plastics, all of these things, no? But at the same time, they are not nature, no? So they are nature, but they are not. This contradiction, and the way that I began to make peace with this idea is to say, well, that's precisely what we need to consider. No, so they are nature, but they are not. So there is an articulation which like in architecture, no, you build houses don't exist in nature, but they're totally natural. So, and then Simondon answers. He says, so it's about an alienation produced by non-knowledge of the technical object. And he says, yes, but I amplify this critique by saying that the technical object must be saved. It must be rescued from its current status, which is miserable and unjust. This status of alienation lies in part with notable authors such as Ducrot, who speaks of the technical slaves. It is necessary to change the conditions in which it is located, in which it is produced, and where it is used primarily because it is used in a degrading manner. It's a question of saving the technical object, just as it is the question of human salvation in the scriptures. So this is very powerful. So but then how to think of this saving? How to think of this saving? And for me, when I was, the saving became, so the problem of meaning with illiteracy is if you want to maintain, so if you don't go to the totally pragmatic, social, arbitrary domain where you just try to make an argument for the sake of the next 5 minutes or 5 days or 2 years, but when you want to maintain a relation to truth or to meaning, which is not just what I want it to be. Now, if you want to maintain a relation to that, Then one way of how a quantum literacy can think of it is in a quantitative way. That means with respect to the laws of conservation, conserving an invariance, which remains cryptical. So an invariance is for example, the amount of energy in the universe. Nobody can give a number to that. But all of thermodynamics works with the thesis that the amount of the energy in the universe can neither become less nor more. We don't know how much it is, but in its sum total, it cannot become more or less. So this is an invariance. So it's substantial, forceful, material, whatever. It's a physical magnitude. But it can only always be counted via the way in which we encode it. But that means what we do in discourse, where there is a voice, is concerned with conservation. Yeah? It's concerned with conservation of invariances. And this is hard. So then you would say, okay, then we are just going to impose a certain set of values, oppose another set of values, which turns it into a social game again, into a dialectical philosophy. So there is no escape out of a dialectical philosophy if you think like that. But if we say we refer to meaning or the values through the instrumentarium, the organon of a quadrivium, so quantitatively. So we don't say what they are, we just say we observe they are there and they help to describe things. Then we can say, no, like so the invariance energy is not the only one. No, so all the natural constants with which physics works, the speed of light and the Max Planck, so they're all names for how to count invariances. And there is not, they are more coming all the time. No? So this is not a fixed system. There are more coming. So why can't we begin to relate to meaning in terms of different cultures, different religions, and so on, in terms of invariances? And then we study, the point is with the assumption of invariances, we can study it descriptively, no, empirically, but it's never about legitimization. It's not about, it's existential, like this wisdom of the peasant in the morning. Yeah. So this I find a beautiful idea. And in terms of that, we can say, well, how do we do it? No, this kind of to save the object, technical object, from its miserable status as being declared a slave. No? And of course, it's clear, no, the technical object just becomes a projective screen for celebrating our own slavery status, our own anger against the system for not being treated equally. So, and it's in the computer, many things are still called slaves. No? So this kind of hierarchy is totally there in the whole of the rhetorics and the vocabulary that describes technical artifacts. So then to say we want to save the technical object from that miserable status means to grant it a certain kind of vivacity, a certain kind of temperament, a certain kind of being animate. Yeah. And how else to do that but to study what an artifact actually signifies, means, symbolizes in a particular local context in which it is used. And it's very clear that this varies greatly. Now, one of the very striking things that we had when we were in Asia, and especially in Korea, there was always, when there was an electricity antenna, they put a tree next to it. So often, and the tree was often cut. It was not even a live tree, but there was something about symbolizing electricity as a natural force among like plants, which I have no way to understand. No, it's a completely different symbolic kind of substrate, which I can't understand it. But because we also know antennas and we have another relationship, it's like a hereality mirror, no, to my own implicit way of relating to electricity. So then with this mirror, there is a space of mimetical projection and representation, which is speculative, but empirical, but existential. It's not about having a legitimate definition in the end. It's about getting in touch, learning to become more familiar with something which is very, very much other, different. But it presupposes an alienation in myself. I need to say what feels completely like me. No? My feeling is there is no truth in it. Well, there is probably some truth in it, but it is not represented by the intensity of the feeling. So I need to have to be at peace with alienating myself in order to have such encounters. And this is what crystallizes in this claim by Simondon. We need to save the technical object. We need to save the technical object in order to find a proportionality. That means a notion of a humanism. That's why, as I make sense of it now, he makes the relation to the scriptures. And in my book, what I did is I described then this quantum literacy in terms of bearing witness to silently spoken words. So I said a technical artifact is spoken, but it's silent. It doesn't, it's not the sound, what it speaks is not present, it's absent. But it's a technical object because it brings certain natural forces into a balance. That's why it works, why it's a mechanical. No? That's why I can put it to the side and bring it back. So it's a kind of a void, in the sense of a harmonic balancing of factors, which it incorporates. And this harmonic bringing into balance, this I called it the silent speaking of statuesque words. It's a very helpless formulation, but I didn't know how to do it better at that point. So statuesque words, they pronounce, they articulate, but negentropically, not entro. So they don't speak out, they provide silence. It's like this idea that is constitutive to the information physics. When we say communication is not from the moment when somebody begins to take the word and speak, and there is a vocation circulating, but there is initially noise. No? So the chaos, initially it's totally noisy, and things start to present themselves when there are moments of relative silence. So, and relative silence means you can start to recognize, so to discrete out of this plenty of the noise. So to discrete the pattern out which can be held on to and which will recur, which you can start to refer to. And the more it shows itself, the more stable it becomes as a word. No? So like this, it's a physical approach to how can the words stand for meaning without having to presuppose an original, an Adamitic kind of language, an Adamitic kind of correspondence between a word and its true referent. So it's in this sense then, the technical artifacts, they manage to speak silently. And this speaking silently goes in parallel to the functioning that they do. And if we have this double, yeah, we can it's not, yeah, kind of a reading, but the reading is a quantum literate reading. It's not a reading for the meaning, it's a reading that tries to preserve, to conserve the meaning which apparently is there. So to produce a model for it. And with this notion now of the model, I would like to shift to architecture, but with the same, in the same context, kind of. So there is this, if you want, an invariant meaning that the house somehow is a miniature of the cosmos. So this in the genealogy of Timaeus. Yeah. So it's, insofar as we can think rationally of the cosmos, or of the cosmos then becomes the world, but endowed with values. So a world which is both natural and human, or animate. So then the world, the model becomes a world model. And the term that many people have been afraid of and exposing is that with industrialization, with modern science, the status of being a kind of a speculative amphora or container of world models turned into a blueprint for production. So it was no longer speculative and daring and not too dangerous to think in terms of world models. It was before because there were so few people doing it. So this is what the communication among the philosophers. I mean, there were so few people thinking in this kind of abstraction. It was a kind of more a kind of a preservation, not a production. The primary aim was not to produce this as a system, but to hold on to it. It was a spiritual relation to it. And this turned with industrial technology, because then you need to have a blueprint which you produce, which you realize, which you make real. And then having world pictures or thinking in terms of world models becomes like the event of the original sin. So then to have a model means you go for a certain project and not for another. And so this is very important in all of the discussions around in the 20th century, but very famous, of course, Heidegger. But I don't want to go with Heidegger with regard to this, but with Hans Blumenberg, who is interesting because he as well worked on this. He tries to find a perspective that doesn't follow the German idealist point of view directly. So he invented, so instead of saying concept and metaphor fall in one, but only when the subject of the spirit speaks. So that's basically the idea in Hegel. He says concept and metaphor cannot really be separated, but he positioned a theory of what he called the absolute metaphor. So he says, we don't exactly know how, but at a certain point, a word which has been metaphorical for a long time turns and becomes a concept. So to relate the absolute to the metaphorical, this is the core idea in Hans Blumenberg. And with it, he began to look philosophically at technology in a way which was quite liberated, in distinction to the compactness of a Heidegger system. No? With Heidegger, it's so dense, you can't really move. So everything is precisely in the place it needs to be for the whole thing to make sense. And Blumenberg kind of, with this notion of the absolute metaphor, was able to begin to encode Heidegger and to test it and to relate it and to basically open up a space of discourse, which, for example, saved me through my PhD. So I'm not a big fan now anymore of Blumenberg because he has these very clear limits that I don't want to accept. But he began to speak then of the problem of these world models which become blueprints for production and for a kind of imperialist conquest by relating it to humanist values which manifest in universities. So he made a big critique on, he didn't say technology or industrialization is the reason for these unfortunate developments, which he also shared as an observation. He said, the problem is that the way that our universities are organized. So he insisted that a university is not a conglomerate of disciplines and faculties. Rather, there is a vivid economy of specialization and interdependency, of solitude and exchange among its fields and its subjects. And this is the scandalous thing, no? A vivid economy. So this means it's psychically charged, the economy. Yeah? It doesn't try to find a rational science of economy, then a sphere of the public which is produced by the science of economy that manifests in our desires, in our consumption patterns, in the artifacts as goods, and so on. So he refused to keep these two things apart, and he said we need to think of them as mixed, and we need to care for what university does in a way that keeps these two things mixed. So a vivid economy of specialization and interdependency, of solitude and exchange among its fields and subjects. And this is still a very good circumscription for me for what I have in mind when I speak of publicness. No? So in a public, it's not about me being recognized in my full truth. No? It's not like I hope to find it with friends. It's public. I'm a person. It's a public face. And it's in degrees, of course. But it's the sphere where we can depend upon people whom we don't trust, whom we don't like, whom we don't know. But there is a shared valuing of an interdependency, which presupposes a dynamics that goes into specialization and discretization, but without allowing these specializations to become tribal proper domains. No? So to become feudal kind of territories. And this critique so this was, I don't know, I guess it was in the 80s that Blumenberg wrote this, but certainly in these past 40 years, that's what we have received. No? So we have feudal systems of disciplinary territories. So that was the starting point with, we need to think about order in discourse, and it needs to reconsider the status of voice, even if it is with regard to writing. Blumenberg's understanding of this university is because he says what is being killed with this territorialization of knowledge is philosophy. But then what is philosophy? Why is it a problem if it's being killed? He says philosophy is the dawning human awareness of itself. So that's the self-referentiality I was talking about. So it's a humanism which wants to think about the human nature. So not one's individual history or the history of my family or of my people, but the dawning awareness of the human of itself. So this is what to Blumenberg is philosophy. And for him, the absolute metaphors were instruments to do this. So that's how we like to think of metaphors and of these turning points. But I want to stay more with this moment of the self-reference. And just to recall this formulation with Hamacher, so with the Amphora, ein Mit ohne Mit. No? So that means Mitteilung as a nature, as a physics of communication, which happens like the weather on many scales at the same time. So there are many mits and many withouts. How to hold this together. And one way of doing that is precisely what René Descartes was all about. So this is this book I was mentioning, where for the first time in the German language, this very famous text, Discours de la méthode, pour bien conduire sa raison, so the discourse on method to guide reason, was written by Descartes, if his philology is right. No? So I told this to Werner Oechslin, and he said, you are working with books, you should know that this philology is totally questionable. Why should this constellation of the text be more true than the singularization that the philologists until now have practiced? Of course, I have no answer to this, except that this is a very opening perspective to reconsider Cartesian thinking, which makes so much more sense than the kind of straw man that he has been turned into. It makes so much more sense. No, and for sure there is evidence enough that this is a real possibility. No? Whether it's the true way to historically interpret it, je m'en fous. I don't care. So, Entwurf as a method, it places this one text as an introduction to essays. Descartes called it essays. Les propres. I'm not sure if essay is the right. Prop is like experiment, yeah, kind of essays. And they were called the dioptra. So they're the instruments, the optical instruments, not subjective perspective, the optical instruments, dioptra, the meteora. So it's Descartes was one of the last that continued this tradition of ancient meteorology that I was talking about. And geometry. Now, this is totally shocking. Geometry for Descartes comes to be on the same level of a kind of, so with the method methods to guide one's reason, one needs to learn how to navigate throughout geometry as if geometry is a landscape, like the meteora is a landscape, or like the dioptra is a landscape. So you don't have a world to which it belongs and where it is already localized, where it already has its territories. It's a probe, it's an essay, it's a field where we can go on empirical adventures if we follow this, what he calls a method. So this is very strong. This is a picture by Descartes. You see this meteora. So it was all about the world. I mean, this book here is actually, that's another story which is crucial to know to give plausibility to this. So this book here, the combination of these four texts, the introduction and then the three fields, it was a miniature of a book which Descartes did write, but did not dare to publish because Giordano Bruno was killed. So he was afraid of publishing it, and he called this book The World, not Cosmos or Cosmology or Cosmogony, but Le Monde, the world. And the subtitle of it is A Treatise on Light. The World, a Treatise on Light. And it's called a Treatise on Light because it's a metaphysics of the optics that was being developed at this time. And it was just before Newton formulated the optics, which then made blackness the totality of the absorbed colors and whiteness the totality of the emitting colors. So the spectrum formulation of optics, with which quantum physics also, in part, at one level works. It was just before that. A treatise on light, and a treatise on light produces what he wants to address as the world. And the genre in which he wrote this book was called a fable. He said, the world, this book is a fable. The world is what can only be fabulated. And yeah, he didn't dare to publish it, so he tried to encrypt its scientific, its more less theologically threatening arguments. He translated it into a method, a notion of instrument, and the way how a method with an instrument can open up, can decrypt a kind of a field of phenomena on different spheres. So meteora is a different sphere or scalarity than the dioptra. But it refuses to have the relation where an instrument mediates between phenomena and knowledge. It is an instrument embodies something like what Heidegger has called an Geführt. So a complex domain which is mythopoetic. That's why he wants to fabulate the world. But this mythopoeticness has a technicality to it. So here you see, what is a place in the meteora? What is a place? But the thing is, all of it can be described through angles and rotations. So angles and rotations. And that's the link to what Elias is always talking about. So natural communication needs to be thought of architectonically through the relation between rotations and angles. And then the rotations and the angles can model how a certain gnomon, also a certain set of algorithms and a certain practice of mnemotechnics, reasons, judges, allows to describe things. I can share the text. I think there is no time to go into it. So I wrote this one article, making a case for Entwurf of the Method, Notes on Cartesian Rationalism Reconsidered, and it's the gesture of the black boxing, if you want, or the encryption is at the core of it. So the crucial phrase with this, if the world is a treatise on light. So we need to think about the world, so to make world models, world pictures, not as representations of an ideated harmony, so of a cosmos as the kind of our ultimate idea of beauty and harmony, but through its physics, so the physics of light. Then we must always affirm this alienation that the true nature of light, la vraie nature de la lumière, will remain obscure. That's why it's a fabulation and a story. So the true nature of it will remain obscure. We cannot totally clarify it. And this connects with regard to his subject. Now he says, what is the minimal assumption I need to make that I am a subject when I'm thinking mathematically? He said, so this is the cogito ergo sum. The minimal assumption I need to make is when I think this sentence, I am there. I'm involved. I'm a subject. Yeah. But what the sentence articulates quantitatively is an object, and then you start to have this dualism. And the idea with the meteora, or in this thinking with the information physics and so on, is that instead of the cogito, so of the I, we should model this I. We can't take this for granted either. Yeah. So we should model this I and speak of it as an it. Like we say, it thinks. So if there is a statement like that, the minimal assumption we need to make is there is a cogito present, but let's say it's an artificial cogito, it's an impersonal cogito. Let's call it an it in the same manner as we use it when we describe the weather. It thinks like it rains. But keep the rigor, keep the mathematicity, keep all of that, but call it an it. Yeah, and the funny thing is that this world, so Descartes really had an architectonic model then for the world in terms of such a treatise of light. He said quite opposite to what he is famous for, no? So we say usually the empty container space is Cartesian. It's such a bullshit. Here it's explicitly a plenum. It's a plenty. The world, the architectonic volume of the world is a plenum, and he doesn't want to say the void exists. He doesn't want to say there is nothing, because this is, of course, the war point with the theology people. No? So the nothing cannot be real. So he didn't want to say that. Instead, he said, and that's why he says it's a fable, it's fabulating. He says it's a plenum, but the plenum has cracks. And through the cracks, they always immediately fill up, but they're part of the plenum. Yeah. So, and the plenum with the cracks is an abstraction. And through this, he has an ideation for a dynamics, which is like this. Yeah. So there is always voids in between. So this is a discretized rendering of the weather. So it's an abstract model, it's an architectonic model. Because the world can only be fabulated through the kind of instrumental reason that he puts, on the assumption that there is a plenum with cracks. Yes. One more turn I want to make. This here is a book. So there is a kind of in Descartes as well. No, the presence of the subject or the ethical role. Why he wrote? I mean, he was trained with the Jesuits, Descartes. No? So he was not at war with religion. It was never Descartes' agenda to say science needs to push back the dominance of theology. The two were not coextensive. That's also why he can accept la true nature de la lumière remains opaque, no? remains obscure. So science cannot get to the core of the true nature, but it doesn't need to subject itself to a certain interpretation of this true nature, so to a certain dogma, a theological dogma. So he never wanted to do that, and it means that science, or the practice of this science, and this is the term of le discours de la méthode. So first, it's interesting that there is a discourse, where the discourse is not to place a statement, to make a claim, to realize a program, but the discourse is actually a way to build a self. No? The discourse is the place, the public place, to practice this kind of alienation, where the acquisition of knowledge is just as much learning to relate to the world, that is not entirely subjective, as it is a practice that informs ourselves, that Bildung, no? So a notion of Bildung both in a quantitative and in a spiritual, in a psychological manner. And there is one author who I think is totally obsessed with Descartes in this manner, and it's Paul Valéry. He wrote a book on, which is very fascinating, on, no, I stay here so I can read, on Leonardo da Vinci. And he applied the thinking of the method, which is very similar to how I described it to you now. So these things, now it was the first time published, but it doesn't mean that earlier people knew about this connection. So that we have not heard of these things is indeed, I would say, a social political consequence. Because since the Second World War, our universities fight theoretical quests. Everything needs to be applicable, applied, demonstrable, pragmatic, and so on. So we have lost this connection, but that doesn't mean that people in the 19th century didn't know it. And I'm very sure all the people, also Husserl, also all the mathematicians, of course, they remembered this from Descartes. Very clear it is, for example, with Simone Weil. So she wrote her thesis on Descartes, on the role of perception in Descartes, Simone Weil. Her brother was André Weil, so from the Bourbaki group. So this understanding of connecting with Descartes was totally normal. The trivial infantile version that we get today, this is very recent. So Paul Valery was one of them who evidently knew it very well, and he did something extraordinary. It's a bit like Pierre Menard. It's a bit like Pierre Menard, the story by Borges. So he said, I want to empathize, to alienate myself such that I can empathize with Leonardo. He studied Leonardo and he thought, how can I write about Leonardo? I don't want to do it in an administrative manner. I'm not an art historian. He was very much at war with the historiographies that his peers produced. So, but then how can I write about it? And he says, I can try to bring my mind into a state that tries to mimic Leonardo so I can capture certain things of him. He has this introduction where he speaks about how he relates to this, because of course there is something super, we would say, unmasked today, no? How can Paul Valery come along and claim that he can resonate, he can have access to a mind like Leonardo's, who is not even here anymore? So he writes, there remain of a man whose things of which one is set dreaming by his name and by the works which make of his name a mark of admiration, of hate, or of indifference. Remembering that he was a thinker, we are able to discover in his works ideas which really originate in ourselves. We can recreate his thoughts in the image of our own. An ordinary man we represent to ourselves with ease. We can reconstruct his elementary actions and reactions from our own simple experience. We find the same processes in the indifferent acts that constitute the exterior aspect of his life as in our own. We are the connecting link between our acts, as he was between his, and the radius of activity that this existence suggests to us does not extend further than the radius of our own. But if we allow that this individual excels in some respect, we shall have more difficulty in imagining to ourselves the works and the ways of his mind. In order not to be confused in our admiration, we shall be forced to stretch our imaginative perception of the quality that dominates in him and of which we no doubt possess only the germ. But if all the faculties of his mind are widely developed at the same time, or if the results of his activity seem to be considerable in all fields, his character becomes thereby more and more difficult to comprehend in its unity, tends to escape from our efforts to understand it. There are distances from one extremity to another of this intellectual area such as we have never covered. The continuity of the whole escapes our perception, as do formless scraps of space, which are divided from each other by objects that we know and which are for us no more than chance intervals. As at each instance, myriads of facts over and above the small number established by language are lost. Nevertheless, we must go slowly, take time before them, and conquer the difficulties that the conjunction of apparently heterogeneous elements lays on our imagination. Every intelligence here gives itself up to inventing a unique order, a single activity, and desires to impose its own image on the system which it imposes on itself, a clear-cut image. With the violence which depends on its range and its lucidity, it finishes by reconquering its own unity. Just as by the operation of some mechanism, a hypothesis becomes clear and proves itself to be the thing which has made the whole, the central revelation in which all has happened, all has had to happen, the monstrous intelligence or strange animal which has woven thousands of pure connections between many forms, and of which those puzzling and varied constructions were the creation's instinct building its habitation. The production of the hypothesis is a phenomenon which admits of variations, but not of chance. Its value is the value of the logical analysis of which it must be the object. It is the basis of the method with which we are going to occupy ourselves and which we are going to utilize. So what he does is something like Descartes did this with the world. He said the world is I cannot ever hope to describe it, to have access to it. So let's make an abstract model and then basically inquire in me what the world can be. And this in me means I need to alienate from my historical, individual, personal me that is born here, living in Vienna, and so on. I need to abstract from this in order to develop a self, which can be a subject and active, that can learn to build an image, to imagine from within itself something that can give me a resolution to see the world. Paul Valery does the same now with, let's say, the instrument of the works of Leonardo. He wrote this, he was very young when he wrote this book, and he wrote about 30 years later another introduction to it, where he is very, he's a bit embarrassed that he did write this book. He says it's a juvenile arrogance, but he held on to the basic idea of it. Yeah. This is all the very interesting documents to read, and what it does is it reconnects with it reconnects with an affirmative relation to mimesis, so to mimic, so to redouble something else, but out of the social scope of competition, out of the cycle that, if I try to become like the one whom I admire, but the more I become like the one whom I admire, the more I become its competitor. So then mimesis doesn't produce knowledge, it produces conflict. So that's the social scope, the anthropological scope of mimesis. But if this mimesis produces objective knowledge, it creates a generous public space, which can, like law cannot solve the problem of injustice, but it can temper it. And knowledge then cannot solve the problem of falsity or truth and lie, but it can temper it by equipping or endowing a public domain, which creates a kind of a meteora in which this is possible. Yeah, maybe I stop with this here. This is, I don't think these ideas, they are just not current today, but they're not very new. So this is, so forget about what I wrote. The important thing is this here. I didn't find the document because my computer crashed. What is interesting is this discourse from, I don't even remember now which one of Plato's dialogues it is, but it's a discourse on mobiles, what he calls mobile statues. And the mobile statues are the artifacts that Daedalus, the architect, produces. So Daedalus, the architect, produces statues that can be moved around. They're like, yeah, they have a lot to do with automatons later. The discourse between Socrates and this character here goes like this. I really do not know, Socrates, how to express what I mean, for somehow or other our arguments, on whatever ground we rest them, seem to turn around and walk away from us. Socrates says, your words are like the handiwork of my ancestor Daedalus. And if I were the sayer or propounder of them, you might say that my arguments walk away and will not remain fixed because I am a descendant of his. For your notions show an inclination to be on the move. Nay, Socrates, I shall still say that you are the Daedalus who sets arguments in motion, not I, certainly, but you make them move and go round. Then I must be greater than Daedalus, for whereas he only made his own inventions to move, I moved those of other people as well. And the beauty of it is that I would rather not. He can't help doing it. For I would give the wisdom of Daedalus to be able to detain them and keep them fixed. No, and the mobile statues of Daedalus, one example is the Trojan horse, no, or it's the figure of Minotaur that allowed the wife of Minotaurus. You know how Minotaurus was conceived? It's a funny story. So the Minos, the king, he made a deal with Zeus to become more influential among his people, and he got the most beautiful bull from the Zeus. But the deal was that he sacrifices the bull to Zeus. And Minos said, I sacrifice another one which looks just like it, no, not the real one. And then Zeus gets very angry and he thinks about how to punish Zeus. And he makes Minos' wife fall in love with the white bull. as an impossible kind of desire, which will destroy his private life. And then his wife got, somehow talked with Daedalus, and Daedalus fabricated a device which allowed his wife to mate with the bull, and the conception of it was the Minotaurus, the very dangerous bull, which then had to be contained in order to continue the history. So this is how myth works, yeah? So you have, it's the continuation transformation space, because you always invent new devices, new amphoras, or new yeah. But this is Daedalus, so these kinds of things are at stake here. And the question is, how are the arguments that the Socratic dialogue tries to achieve, no, and to expose, so to put on a pedestal as being philosophical, not just sophistic? How are they different? So it's the same, yeah, it's very much the same temperament, I would say, that is at stake with this self-referentiality, the self-freedom, the fabulation of the world in Descartes. And one last reference that helps to look around with this is a book by, not only one book, it's actually all the books, by Susan K. Langer. She was a philosopher. She studied with Whitehead and with Cassirer. And for me, the key book is her first book, which is Philosophy in a New Key. What she basically purports and takes as a starting point is to say the knowledge which philosophy handles is itself a product of nature, but the nature is being cultivated by the different cultures in ways that it can exhaust its fertility and it can regenerate it. No? So to leave certain concepts. So when we think that we get rid of a certain concept, like the mobile statues, it is just for a time. So then these concepts, they need to rest, the ground need to recover, and a generation later you can start to, this same concept, which was completely impotent at one point, suddenly becomes to be fertile again. So it's a kind of a culture practice to relate to what Blumenberg wants to expose as absolute metaphor. No, it's a similar process, but there is a process, a nature of corruption and generation attached to it. So it's not a formal abstraction like it is for Blumenberg. So there is a nature, and then you can, and the key is always, she says, the key is not so much in the way that she relates to it, is not so much directly cryptography. But the key is more like you can get in tune with what these concepts have to say, what they can let you see. And the key is it's quite directly a musical metaphor. It's not in her, it's not a rationalized one. It wouldn't make the connection of the key here to the tetractys, which comes with the rationalization of it. But it's very beautiful and it's very precise and extremely helpful in giving a vocabulary to navigate this kind of natural philosophy domain that wants to work empirically, be committed to the world, not to some transcendence of it. Yeah, you can download it. It's on Monoscope. Monoscope is this fantastic website with a lot of the modernist literature all there to download. And what is important about her is she did her PhD with Cassirer and Whitehead. So with two mathematicians, philosophers, Whitehead with the process ontology, and Cassirer with the symbolic forms. So Cassirer didn't want, but yeah, it's enough. A picture of the tetractys to end. The tetractys and the the way it was thought. And so the tetractys is all of them. It's unity, it's dyad, it's harmony, and it's cosmos. And the beauty of reading the 10 books as a tetractys is that it's not, then it's really, so this is the instrument with which to write the body of architecture. And the body that can be written of architecture with the tetractys is a miniature of the cosmos, but not a representation. It's bringing the human relation to its cosmos to scales. This, I think, is what Ludger will be talking about. So it's how he organizes his 10 books now. That's it. Thanks.
past days, first of all, thank you. But for the past days, I've been wondering about the forms of intuition. And with all the metaphysics and stuff that comes up, but even if you try to rationalize an instrument and find tools and different kinds of methods about things, there's always this, this feeling of uncertainty or intuition that comes into play. And when you talked about Kant and forms of intuition, which describes in space and time, the sensory experiences that are kind of like organized as images. You said there were some sorts of objective forms of intuition, but it couldn't quite make sense of how they would look like.
Yeah. I would say that maybe they are the technical artifacts. So they're embodied, huh? They're embodied and they're alien. But in order to recognize them or to have a relation to it that makes them more than a dead thing, opens up a play of intuiting, perhaps. But this is now ad hoc made up. So the objective forms of intuition, but that's what I. So the symmetry goes like this: that the forms of intuition in Kant are time and space, because he says they are universal for all of our minds. So our minds have, whether evolved or are created, such that it can make sense of time and space. So they are transcendent, but they bilden unser Denken, diese Formen. So, und das ist nicht it's not intuition itself, it's that they come in form, time and space. And with the objective transcendental that we get with Serre's thinking, it's the object. So every subject is everywhere, but needs to think itself always as an object among objects. So all things. So then our thinking would have the same disposition like the computer or this wooden floor. Yeah. But there is some of it, like with this kernel in it. So that's the story with life. No? So on the level of the DNA, everything which exists incorporates all that has ever existed in the DNA, because the DNA is this memory store. It's the storage of everything that has ever existed in the universe in terms of nature, in terms of physics, no? Not in terms of creation. So everything is in principle in everything. So then we need to relate to it as an agency, so as a subject, but as an object among objects. So that means bringing into proportion. So taking it into account according to the problem of the commensurability. So in an adequate proportion, between scalarities. That's how I can imagine now what that would be. But the important is that intuition is a kind of a force. So it's not to say we don't need intuition. The question is, how do we rationalize it? And it's not one homogeneous axiomatic body of forms which can rationalize it, which it was with Kant. But then if it's many, it's no longer human. No, it's no longer specific to human.
Would you connect this to the kind of difference that one makes between an end within itself and an end which is outside of itself? I think you were mentioning this. So basically the difference between praxis and creative. So something that has an end outside of itself, something that has an end in itself. So would this then be a difference which is not summatizable?
I would say so, yes. I mean, that's why I was in the lecture before with voice and discourse. It was all about speaking at least double. Yeah. So don't only speak to the people who listen to you. Have a kind of an inner discourse, whether you call it a prayer or whether you call it a Selbstbildung or whether you call it whatever. But don't make communication dependent upon the immediate social reception of it, because this reduces what happens in communication to your intention. So to have this double voice, a bit like the jar, no? To have a containment towards the inside, which tries to make room, which tries to find silence, which tries to produce a void, so to make room, yeah. and towards the outside to contain, or to protect. And you could say there are then two telos, no? And both are impossible. But from managing this, the maintenance of this impossibility, what you can do is make a jar, abstract, or relate to it, or keep it, conserve it. No, it's not about making it; it's about keeping it capable of being a jar.
Then this kind of double surface of the jar, double boundary, will it have something to do with the relation between entropy and potential?
Yeah, very much. So yes. Yeah, but it's a twisted one. It's a gestülpt one. It's not that the jar is empty. It's not an organism. It's not a body, which is so the body embodies negentropy, no? And the environment is entropy, and the body forms because it negates some of the entropy in which it lives, and from how it negates it, its organism is organized. So the jar makes one more abstraction. It goes on the next scale of the spiral, and it says, now I need to negate, so das Mit ohne Mit, no, of Hamacher. So then I need to not just claim the space for my bodily presence, but I need to annihilate my bodily presence. When Descartes tries to get rid of his body, it's not because he hates his body, or I mean, maybe he does, who cares, no? But this is the step of abstraction that gives the alienation, which allows for the possibility to find oneself in the world through a rational method. So the emptiness needs to be made. It's not given. It needs to be made and achieved. And this is what the impersonality strives to do. And it's clear of this cogito. And it's clear that this impersonality is not either. So it's not that you are either impersonal or personal. You're always all of it. Yeah. It's not that when you try to get rid of your body through meditation, you don't actually have your body. And it still conditions you, or the other way around, that from meditation you wouldn't gain anything for your Körpergefühl. But it's a question of combining intellection and sensuality in a way that works abductively. I like the term abductive.
Yeah, it's interesting because, for instance, with this, it's only so in Averroes, there's this notion of the image as the hook anu, so the non without, or something like this. And this is somehow, so images are lively, but this aspect is not lively, so it's combined society. So it's twisting, but then that is related to liveliness. So, and this is, I have the feeling this is what somehow is not there in Gnomon. Then there is within there's only the without. So and then there's not the pull of the throw in that sense.
Yeah.
So and then what I think is that Heidegger then gets right is that this without comes with a with all the time, and then if you don't recognize this with becomes what he calls the reason pattern in gigantic soul, which is this kind of leftover or this residue that
keeps becoming more and more oppressive. Yeah, but this is why the philology gesture. So Hamacher goes a different path than Heidegger in that point, because Heidegger, he's interested in an ontology, no? So he wants to find an ontology. So in my parlance, he remains axiomatic. So he wants an ontology. But he says in this ontology, there will be a force at work, which is history, the spindle of time, which gives the Geviert, and the ontology can never succeed in grasping and settling the places of things in the Geviert. But still, he wants an ontology. So he's an idealist. And in the philology approach of Hamacher, it's not about an ontology. It's about the categoricity of the kind of tempered ontology that Heidegger was looking for. How do we address these places? It's not where do we place them, but how do we address these places? And this is evocative of the publicness of an ontology. And then this publicness can accommodate an ontology which is dynamic and phenomenal, like Heidegger was looking for it.
Yeah, but I don't know if this would be something also last week, but perhaps we Heidegger get more a kind of accusative, so Hamacher get more procurator.
Yeah.
So it's more within the setup.
Yeah.
Case.
Yeah. No, Heidegger goes with with the accusative, but then he says, I don't want to accuse, so I want to be out of the legal domain, no? And then that's why it's a sacred in Heidegger, and in Hamacher it's he's an advocate, so he defends what has been accused. So he exhausts itself in defending what has been accused, and through that can articulate the amphoras for it, not the place, but the amphoras.
I've been thinking since your last talk about the voice and this impersonal it thinks, and then I was thinking to think about what this voice, how this voice might be. Is it just as simple as saying it speaks? And then I was thinking Foucault, when you were quoting from this Foucault, the Discourse on Language. And I think it's Beckett who he quotes saying, I must go on, I can't go on, I'll go on. And then Beckett has all these different texts which are dealing with trying to erode the subjective, any kind of pronoun. I mean, he says quite explicitly in there's this little short text called "Not I." I don't know how.
I don't know.
So it's called "Not I," and it's just a mouth, just a spotlight on a woman's mouth, and she's talking about saying kind of lots of variations on "Not I," and then there's only one stage direction in that play, and he says at one point trying but failing to get rid of the third person pronoun. So I think Beckett was really quite into this, but he was approaching it from a position of negation, always, at least one negation, if not double negations. And so I was wondering if a way to think about it now, and because I'm also really interested in this, how to think about a voice in this way now, and I wouldn't do it through Beckett, but I wonder if that's why it's interesting to go back to before Beckett, and why Joyce is still quite, for me anyway, an interesting figure, because it's always an affirmation rather than a negation. But I guess to you, when you think about voice in this way, connecting voice with void, or this cipher, like I think you said today, is it as simple as saying it speaks, or is that too much of a simple gesture?
I don't see this as simple at all.
Okay.
I mean, it's a gesture of, the point is to relate affirmatively to abstraction without affirming or negating a certain level of generalization. Basically, to affirm abstraction in a way of affirming a universal, but not going. And the problem with the problem with affirmation is always that you identify with your object. So that means you make yourself a conspirator to the divine, or whatever it is that you affirm. And the problem with negation is that it's exhausting. So you can't go on. Yeah. So this is very basic. And the question with the affirming abstraction in relation, but not as universal, not as producing universal, but as participating, but being of universality, but something else. No? So an architectonic, an artificial, a coded domain, an arbitrary one. This means you need both of these gestures, affirmation and negation. So you need the energy of the affirmation. This, I would say, relates to intuition as well. But then you need to alienate yourself from your own affirmation. And for that, you need the negation. But then to work with the negation, you need to affirm again something. So it's an interplay. And that's what it means. So whatever you say, it has a little bit affinities, of course, with the Kantian categorical imperative, no? So don't try to come up with a set of values, what you should do and what you should not do. Take a mechanism as its organizing principle, and the mechanism is don't do to somebody what you would not like to be done to you. Yeah. And that's this self-referentiality. And then this it, so to bring yourself as an I or as a you to an it, the it is the public place. It's not that I am totally there in this it, but insofar as you and I can coexist in the domain of the it, we need both to find place there. And it's not exhaustive, but it's codependent. That's why it's public. It's not just a relation of host and guest. It's of owning it together in the public. And that's the process where this alienation needs to go together with an affirmation at the same time. And then I guess ultimately, no, but this becomes then, yeah. So different temperaments. It makes a difference whether you will say ultimately through these alienations you become who you are, or you say you realize something purposeful in your life. So there are different ethics that can be attached to it. They don't need to be the same. But this is super interesting in relation to how to think the question of gender and sex, yeah, for the social, very much at the core. And what I'm critical about is that most of the approaches today, except the Xenofeminist Manifesto, they just want to claim a private space where they're left in peace, in the public. It lives from the public, it feeds from the public, but it says it's my right to be paid back because I have been treated inadequate before. That's what I don't like. Even so, I understand and I think it's right, and it's even legitimate and justified, of course, but it does not help. So the public in terms of places, and then the discretion, the Hamacher is so, place is discretion. No? Place is not only something discrete, it is discretion itself. And then discretion becomes the act where contingencies can be contemporary without forming a synthesis. Yeah. Again? The it? Well, physicality, I mean, atoms don't really have one either, do they? So it's not matter, but it's mass. But the point of the quantum physics perspective is that you never get matter pure without form. So mass and information articulate what we call the materiality of physics. And in that sense, so then what you say that the materiality of physics must have force, no? So there must be consequences to it. And of course, a body of thinking has consequences. Of course, there is a real effectuality of it, which precisely unfolds in the coexistence, in cohabitation of space. So your body of thinking can be generous or super tyrannic, can be aggressive, it can be it is usually all of this, no? But that's precisely why we need to have an active relation to it. But it's why I affirm so the science, no? Because it says knowledge needs to be reproducible and shareable, independent of who we are. That's the thing with the mechanism, no? So it will not depend whether I want it to work. If it's one, it works, and it works for you even if you don't believe in it. Yeah. So this kind of mobility, of transferability of knowledge. But it's clear that this is super partial, and probably I would also say the things that define me most cannot be handled like that. But the two don't exclude one another. It's like, of course I want my private space, but I'm glad I can live in the city. Okay, let's make a break. We are over time, but not too bad. I think we have 2 hours for lunch, so we can cut it a little bit short. Hmm?
I think we started.
We still have time.
Maybe you don't have time. Now, great. Everything is going to be okay.
Good. Let's have coffee.